The sun was setting as Sarah parked her car outside the cabin. It was everything she had hoped for: quiet, secluded, and peaceful. Just what she needed after the chaos back in the city. She dragged her bags inside and took in the rustic charm: a cozy living room, a small kitchen, and stairs leading up to the bedroom. As she walked upstairs, she noticed something odd: a hatched door in the floor at the top of the stairs. It was the kind of door you'd expect in an old cellar. She hesitated, but then shrugged. "Probably just storage," she muttered. She pulled the hatch shut and went about settling in. That night, as she lay in bed, a faint whisper drifted up through the floorboards. "Who's up there?" Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. She sat up in bed, listening, her eyes wide. The TV was on, casting flickering light across the room, but everything else was still. Too still. She grabbed the remote and muted the TV. Silence. Maybe it was my imagination, she thought, shaking her head. But the air felt heavy, like the cabin was holding its breath. Reluctantly, she walked to the hatch door, checking it was still closed. She stood there, listening, but no sound came. "I'm just tired," she whispered to herself. But as she lay back down, the unease lingered. The next night, just as Sarah was finally falling asleep, it came again. "Who's up there?" This time, the voice was louder, clearer. Sarah bolted upright. She wasn't imagining it. Grabbing a flashlight, she approached the hatch door, her pulse racing. Slowly, she lifted the door and shined the beam down the narrow staircase. Nothing moved, but the darkness seemed to press in on her. "Hello," she called, her voice trembling. There was no reply, only the soft creak of the house settling. She descended halfway down the stairs, her flashlight revealing nothing but old wooden beams and shadows. "Probably just the wind," she muttered, trying to convince herself. She closed the hatch tightly and went back to bed, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The third night, the sounds returned, more insistent. Sarah was wide awake now, her eyes fixed on the hatch door. The voice was clearer, accompanied by faint footsteps. "Who's up there?" The floorboards creaked as if someone was pacing beneath her bed. Suddenly, the hatch door rattled violently, as though someone or something was trying to force its way up. Sarah shot out of bed, heart pounding in her throat, and shoved a chair against the hatch, bracing it. The rattling stopped, leaving only the sound of her ragged breathing in the silence. The cabin felt like a trap, the walls too close. She was no longer alone here. "Leave me alone," she screamed into the silence. But the only answer was the oppressive quiet. Barefoot and frantic, Sarah ran out of the cabin, sprinting down the dirt path to her nearest neighbor. She pounded on the door until an old man answered, his face blank and unreadable. "Please, there's someone in my cabin," she gasped. "I keep hearing this voice, and the door, it's like something's trying to get in." The man just stared at her, his expression disturbingly calm. "Finally," he said in a low voice, "you shouldn't have come here." Sarah's stomach twisted with fear. "What do you mean?" "He never stays quiet for long," the man said cryptically, his eyes gleaming in the dim light. "He needs someone." She backed away, unnerved by his words. "Someone, for what?" she asked, but the man only smiled before closing the door in her face. Terrified and confused, Sarah ran back to the cabin, her mind racing. What had he meant? She slammed the door behind her, locking it, and cautiously moved through the house. The hatch was still shut, the chair still braced against it. Maybe it had all been in her head, she thought. But when she climbed the stairs, her breath caught in her throat. There, on the bed, sat a man, his back to her, watching the TV. Sarah froze, too scared to speak, her eyes locked on the stranger. He was motionless, his pale skin almost translucent in the flickering light. Gathering all her courage, she whispered, "Who are you?" Slowly, the man's head turned, just enough for her to glimpse his face. Hollow, empty eyes stared back at her. Before she could scream, her legs carried her out the door, down the stairs, and outside. Sarah fumbled with her phone, calling 911 from the safety of her locked car. Her breath fogged the windows as she watched the cabin, her eyes darting between the house and the woods. The operator's voice was a blur in her ear as she watched movement near the trees, a figure slipping away into the forest. When the police arrived, they searched the house but found nothing. No man. No signs of forced entry. The hatch was undisturbed. But Sarah couldn't shake the dread gnawing at her insides. As she stood by the police car, the landlord arrived, concern written across his face. "What happened here?" he asked. Sarah, trembling, recounted everything: the man, the voice, the neighbor's warning. The landlord listened quietly, then tilted his head. "Did he look like me?" he asked softly. Sarah's blood ran cold as the landlord smiled. "He always needs one more to stay quiet." The cool night air clung to Emily as she walked along the dark, deserted road. It was her third night making the lonely trek home since her car broke down. The walk was only an hour, but the isolation was unsettling. Trees flanked the narrow road on both sides, their branches rustling softly in the breeze. She sighed, adjusting her bag on her shoulder. The faint sound of a motor reached her ears, growing louder in the distance. Emily turned her head, just in time to see a white van slowly approaching, its headlights off. It rolled past her, moving too slowly, too quietly. She quickened her pace, her pulse quickening as the van disappeared around the bend. The quiet returned, but Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. She glanced back down the road, half expecting to see the van return. But there was nothing, just the lonely stretch of pavement behind her. She tried to calm herself, thinking it was just someone heading home late, like her. But that small, creeping feeling of unease clung to her as she continued walking. Then, as if her thoughts had summoned it, the hum of the van's engine returned. Her heart skipped a beat when she saw it again, this time trailing her from behind, headlights still off. Emily's pace quickened, her footsteps echoing on the empty road. The van followed at a crawl, as if studying her movements, waiting. A sense of dread curled in her stomach. She didn't dare stop to look back. Suddenly, the van accelerated. Emily's breath caught in her throat as it sped past her, screeching to a halt about 100 feet ahead. She froze, her eyes locked on the van, the tension building with every second. The driver's side door slowly creaked open, but no one stepped out. Panic surged through her. Emily's instincts screamed at her to run. Without thinking, she bolted into the nearby woods, her feet pounding against the dirt as branches whipped against her skin. She darted between the trees, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. Behind her, the van's door hung open, still, silent, but she didn't look back. She slipped deeper into the forest, stopping behind a large tree, her heart hammering in her chest. Silence. Only the wind rustling the leaves. But then, she heard it, a voice, low and commanding. "Find her. She's the one." Emily's heart raced as footsteps crunched through the underbrush. She pressed herself tightly against the tree, hands trembling. The voice continued, closer now, more insistent. "Find her." She held her breath, afraid to even move. The voices were getting nearer, the sound of footsteps circling her hiding spot. Panic clawed at her chest, but she stayed rooted in place, praying they wouldn't find her. A group of shadowy figures moved past her, their flashlights casting eerie beams of light through the trees. For a moment, she thought one of them had seen her, but they continued forward, their voices growing fainter. After what felt like an eternity, the voices faded into the distance. Emily waited, barely daring to breathe. Once she was sure they were gone, she crept out from behind the tree and made her way back toward the road, glancing over her shoulder every few steps. She reached the road and broke into a full sprint, not stopping until her house came into view. Her feet pounded the pavement as she raced up her front steps, fumbling with her keys. She threw the door open, slammed it shut behind her, and locked it. Safe at last. Emily leaned against the door, trying to catch her breath. She grabbed her phone and quickly dialed 911, her fingers trembling. As the operator answered, Emily moved toward the window, peeking outside to see if the van had followed her home. Her blood ran cold. There, parked across the street, was the white van, its headlights off, as if waiting. The driver's side door was still open, but there was no one inside. As she squinted, something strange caught her eye. In the rearview mirror of the van, she saw a reflection. It was her. Not standing in her house, but still out on the road. Her heart pounded in her chest as the realization hit her. She hadn't made it home. She was still in the van. And it was still driving. The quiet hum of the TV filled the dimly lit bedroom as James and his wife, Laura, prepared for bed. Outside, their suburban neighborhood was still, with only the occasional rustle of the wind through the trees. The sudden ring of the landline phone shattered the silence, making both of them jump. James frowned at the clock, past midnight. He picked up the receiver, his voice low and cautious. "Hello." On the other end, a familiar voice spoke. "Do you see him?" It was Mr. Alton, their neighbor. "What?" James asked, glancing out of the window, confused. "What are you talking about?" "The man standing outside your house," Alton replied, his tone urgent. James's stomach twisted as he slowly approached the window. Peeking through the blinds, he scanned the street outside. The soft glow of the streetlights illuminated the sidewalk, but it was empty. No one stood outside. "There's no one here, Alton," James said, but the line had already gone dead. "What's going on?" Laura asked, brushing her hair as she prepared for bed. "It's Alton. He says there's someone outside," James replied, still staring out the window. "But I don't see anyone." Laura sighed. "It's probably nothing. Come on, let's go to sleep." James hesitated but nodded, trying to shake off the unease. He returned to bed, but his mind lingered on Alton's strange call. Just as James was beginning to drift off, the phone rang again, louder and more insistent this time. With a groan, he reached over to answer it. "James," Alton's voice crackled through the receiver, more urgent than before. "Look again. He's there now." James's heart raced as he climbed out of bed and returned to the window. This time, his breath caught in his throat. A dark figure stood on the corner of the street, just under the dim light of the street lamp. The figure didn't move, just stood there, watching. He called out to Laura, who joined him at the window, her face scrunched in confusion. "It's probably just a prank," she said. "Teenagers, maybe." James wasn't convinced. His hand trembled as he hung up the phone. He stared at the figure, but it remained still, not coming any closer. The next morning, James tried to shrug off the strange encounter, but the memory of the hooded figure gnawed at him. After work, he made his way over to Mr. Alton's house. Alton answered the door, looking just as confused as James felt. "Alton, why did you call me last night? What's going on with the man outside my house?" James demanded. Alton blinked, shaking his head. "James, I didn't call you. I went to bed early, I don't know what you're talking about." James froze. "But you called me. Twice. You told me about the man." Alton stared back at him, his confusion genuine. "I swear, I didn't call you. Is everything okay?" James left, more unsettled than before. That night, as he and Laura settled into their living room, he tried to relax, but the lingering tension remained. Then, the phone rang again. James's hand hovered over the receiver before he finally answered. His back, Alton's voice whispered through the line. "He's closer this time." James dropped the phone and ran to the window. His heart pounded in his chest as he scanned the street. The figure was no longer standing on the corner. Now, it was at the end of his driveway, perfectly still, shrouded in darkness. His breath hitched. "Laura, come here." Laura joined him, her face paling as she spotted the figure. It hadn't moved an inch, but its mere presence was suffocating. "What is this?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "What do they want?" James shook his head, feeling helpless. He grabbed the phone, ready to call Alton back. But before he could dial, the phone rang again, the caller ID displaying Mr. Alton's number. James answered the phone, his voice shaking. "Alton, what the hell is going on? Who is this person outside my house?" There was a pause. Then, Alton's voice came through, cold and unfamiliar. "James, I never called you." James's heart stopped. "What do you mean? You've called me 3 times. "No," Alton interrupted, his voice eerily calm. "I'm not calling from my house, James. I'm already inside." James turned slowly, his blood running cold. Standing in the doorway to the living room was the hooded figure, its face hidden in shadow. Before James could react, the figure took a step toward him. The phone slipped from James's hand, clattering to the floor. He opened his mouth to scream, but the room plunged into darkness. The road stretched out endlessly in front of Claire, the steady hum of her car's engine the only sound breaking the silence of the late night. She had been working late again, and the exhaustion weighed heavily on her as she navigated the empty highway. The streetlights were few and far between, casting brief, flickering patches of light through the car. With a tired sigh, Claire reached for the lock button on the door, pressing it to hear the familiar click of all the doors locking. She glanced at the rearview mirror out of habit, and froze. For a split second, she thought she saw someone sitting in the back seat. A pale man, dressed in dark clothes. Her heart raced. Claire's grip on the steering wheel tightened as she slammed on the brakes, swerving the car to the side of the road. The tires screeched as she came to an abrupt stop. Her breath came in short gasps as she whipped around in her seat, eyes wide. The back seat was empty. She stayed there for a moment, staring into the darkness, trying to catch her breath. "You're just tired," she whispered to herself. "You imagined it." She shook her head, trying to convince herself, but her hands still trembled as she turned back to the front, shifting the car into gear. Claire resumed driving, but her eyes kept darting back to the rearview mirror. The road was empty, the night eerily quiet, but she couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there. A few minutes later, she glanced up again, and her blood ran cold. The man was back. This time, he was closer, sitting in the middle of the back seat, his face pale and expressionless. Claire's breath hitched in her throat, her heart pounding in her ears. She braced herself, her hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel. She forced herself to look back, nothing. The back seat was empty again. Her pulse raced, and she felt a rising panic. Was her mind playing tricks on her? Spotting a gas station up ahead, Claire pulled in, her nerves on edge. She parked haphazardly and leapt out of the car, running inside, her breaths coming in short bursts. The bright lights of the station felt safe, comforting, compared to the oppressive darkness outside. She leaned against the counter for a moment, trying to steady herself. After a few deep breaths, she ventured back to the car and opened the back door, checking the seats, under the seats, everywhere. There was no sign of anyone, no trace that anyone had ever been there. Claire shook her head, her hands still shaking. "I'm just overtired." "It's nothing," she muttered. She got back into the driver's seat, but her eyes kept scanning the mirrors nervously. As she pulled out of the gas station, Claire tried to focus on the road ahead, but her mind raced. Her hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles were white. She kept glancing at the rearview mirror, waiting for the figure to reappear. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw it. Her breath caught in her throat as she realized he was no longer in the back seat. He was sitting beside her, in the passenger seat, his pale face turned forward, staring straight ahead. She gasped, slamming the brakes again. The car screeched to a halt in the middle of the empty road, but when she turned to look, the passenger seat was empty. Claire's heart pounded in her chest. She felt trapped, like something was toying with her. Desperate, Claire fumbled with her phone, but there was no signal. Panic surged through her veins. She had to get help, she had to get to the police station. She slammed her foot on the gas pedal, the car speeding down the winding road. Her eyes kept darting to the passenger seat, expecting the man to return, but the seat remained empty. The road stretched endlessly in front of her, the streetlights few and far between, casting long shadows over the highway. Almost there, she whispered to herself, her voice trembling with fear. Finally, the lights of the police station came into view. Relief flooded through Claire as she pulled into the parking lot, her tires screeching to a halt. She reached for the door handle, ready to run inside, but before she could open the door, a cold voice whispered beside her. "You should never have come back." Claire froze, her eyes widening in terror. Slowly, she turned to the passenger seat. The man was sitting there, his face close to hers, his pale eyes locked on hers. Her heart pounded as she turned her head back toward the police station, only to find it gone. In its place was an old, dilapidated house, its windows broken, its roof caving in. Her stomach dropped. She had been driving in circles. There was no police station. No road. She was trapped. The man leaned in closer, his voice cold and final. "You're already home." The sun had long since set, and the grand country estate was bathed in shadows. Inside, the only sound was Sarah's footsteps as she moved from room to room, performing her nightly lockup. The large, old house creaked in response to the cooling night air, adding to the eerie stillness. As the live-in caretaker, Sarah had grown accustomed to the isolation. It was part of the job. She made her way down the long hallway toward the spare bedroom at the end of the hall, her final stop for the night. She reached for the door, frowning. It was slightly ajar. "I could have sworn I closed this earlier," she muttered. Pushing the door open, she peered inside. The room was just as she had left it, neatly arranged, untouched. Shaking her head, Sarah pulled the door closed again. Maybe she was just tired. The following evening, Sarah went through her usual routine again. The house felt more oppressive tonight, the shadows darker, the quiet heavier. As she approached the spare bedroom, a sense of unease crept over her. The door was ajar again, wider this time. Her pulse quickened. She distinctly remembered closing it the night before. With a shaky hand, she pushed the door open. This time, the chair at the desk was pulled out, as though someone had been sitting there. And on the desk was something that hadn't been there before, a photograph. She picked it up carefully. It was old and faded, showing a group of people in front of the house. One person's face had been violently scratched out. Each night that followed, the spare bedroom seemed to defy Sarah's efforts to keep it secure. Every evening, she would find the door ajar, no matter how tightly she closed it. Inside, small changes unnerved her, a lamp turned on, the bed slightly rumpled. And always, the photograph on the desk. The photograph grew more disturbing with each passing night. The scratches over the figure's face deepened, and one night Sarah found faint handprints smudged across the walls. She stared at the marks, her breath shallow. "What is happening here?" she whispered to herself, the fear rising in her chest. Determined to stop whatever was happening, Sarah decided to lock the spare bedroom door. She fetched the old brass key from the kitchen drawer and inserted it into the door's lock with a satisfying click. Testing the handle, she confirmed it was securely locked. "There," she said, feeling a brief wave of relief. The house was quiet again, and for a moment, Sarah felt in control. She returned to her bedroom, the hallway behind her disappearing into darkness. But sleep didn't come easily that night. She kept replaying the strange occurrences in her head. The photograph. The handprints. Her imagination had to be getting the better of her, right? The next morning, Sarah walked down the hallway, her heart pounding with anticipation. She had locked the door. There was no way it could be open now. But when she reached the spare bedroom, her breath caught in her throat. The door was wide open. Dread washed over her as she stepped inside. The chair was pulled out again, but this time, something else had changed. She froze as she saw the photograph on the desk. It was no longer the same group of people. Now, it was a picture of her. Sarah, asleep in her own bed. Her stomach dropped, and a cold sweat broke out over her skin. Someone, or something, had been watching her. Panic surged through her. She needed to get out of the house, now. Racing downstairs, Sarah frantically searched for her car keys, her hands shaking as she threw open drawers and rifled through her bag. They weren't where she had left them. "Where are they?" she muttered, her voice trembling. "Where are my keys?" Just then, she heard it, a soft creak from upstairs, like the sound of a door slowly opening. Her heart nearly stopped. The noise came from the spare bedroom. Terrified but driven by a strange compulsion, Sarah found herself climbing the stairs again, each step creaking loudly underfoot. She felt the air grow colder as she neared the spare bedroom. The door was now fully open, revealing the dark room inside. Her breath hitched as she peered inside. Sitting in the chair at the desk was a shadowy figure. Its back was to her, but it held something in its hands, the photograph. The figure slowly turned its head, just enough for Sarah to hear its rasping voice. "I've been waiting for you." The figure's pale, hollow eyes locked onto hers, and Sarah's scream echoed through the house as the screen faded to black.